Snow falls in silence, but the mountain does not sleep. Long before sunrise, the cold has already hardened the earth into iron. Lanterns flicker along the timberline where men move through the darkness in heavy wool coats, stiff with frost. Their boots crush the snow with dull, deliberate steps. Every breath rises in thick clouds that vanish instantly into the black sky. Somewhere above them, deep in the forest, something wakes. The first sound is not a roar. It is a slow, grinding groan, metal tightening against frozen steel. A cable trembles across the hillside, pulleys creak, timber braces shudder as tension climbs through hundreds of feet of wire rope stretched across the slope. Then the engine fires. Steam explodes through iron valves. Pistons slam forward with a violent rhythm. The machine lurches against the ground like a chained animal, and the mountain answers. Far above the camp, a forest begins to move. Whole trees 60, 70 feet long shudder where they lie. Chains snap tight around their trunks. The steel cable draws taut as a drawn bowstring. Snow erupts around the logs as thousands of pounds of timber suddenly tear free from the frozen ground. One by one, the trunks begin sliding, at first slowly, then faster. Soon an entire hillside is in motion. Dozens of trees scrape downward through snow and stone, ripping through brush and shattered stumps as if the mountain itself were being peeled open. The cable screams under the strain. Sparks flash where metal grinds against rock. At the base of the slope sits the machine responsible. 30 tons of iron, gears, drums, and steam pressure anchored to a frozen clearing. The men call it the donkey, but nothing about it is small. This engine drags entire forests down mountains, and every winter morning before the sun reaches the valley, it begins again. The clearing at the base of the slope is carved directly from the mountain. Snow has been trampled into a gray crust by boots, sled runners, and the heavy tracks of timber dragged through the camp. The forest rises on every side, dense with fir and cedar, their branches sagging under the weight of winter. At the center of the clearing sits the machine, 30 tons of iron anchored to a timber platform sunk deep into frozen earth. Its body is built from riveted steel plates, blackened by years of soot and heat. Thick cylinders rise from the frame like the limbs of some mechanical animal. Valves hiss softly as pressure builds inside the boiler. A pair of enormous steel drums dominate the front of the engine, each wrapped in hundreds of feet of wire cable. The cables stretch outward across the mountainside. They vanish into the forest, threading through blocks and pulleys attached to standing trees far above the camp. The lines climb the slope for hundreds of yards until they disappear among fallen timber scattered across the hillside. The men call these lines lifelines, but they behave more like chains. Beside the machine stands the engineer. His coat is layered with wool and leather darkened by grease. His beard is rimed with frost. One gloved hand rests on the throttle lever while the other watches the pressure gauge mounted beside the boiler door. 100 pounds of steam. The needle rises. 120. Inside the firebox, coal burns with a dull red fury. Flames lick along the interior plates of the boiler, turning water into explosive power. The machine trembles slightly as pressure climbs. Around the clearing, crews prepare the morning's haul. Loggers move like shadows between the trees. Each man carries a length of chain or a heavy steel hook known as a choker. Their work lies far above the camp where the hillside is already littered with the bodies of trees cut the day before. Each trunk weighs several tons. Together they weigh hundreds. Up on the slope, the choker setters move carefully among the fallen logs. Snow covers the ground, hiding broken branches and splintered stumps that can twist an ankle in an instant. They work quickly because once the signal is given, the mountain itself will begin to move. A man kneels beside a massive Douglas fir nearly 70 feet long. The trunk is wider than his chest. He wraps the steel cable around the log and fastens the choker tight. One by one, the crew connects dozens of logs to the same line until the hillside looks less like a forest and more like a battlefield of fallen giants. Far below, the engineer watches the signal line. A thin cord runs from the hillside down to the machine. It trembles slightly as the choker setters tug twice. Ready. The engineer grips the throttle. Steam roars into the cylinders. The pistons drive forward with sudden violence, turning the great drums mounted on the front of the engine. Wire cable begins to wind around the steel spools, each rotation tightening the line stretched across the mountain. At first the logs resist. Snow holds them in place. Frozen soil grips the bark like cement. Then the cable pulls harder. Tension climbs through the wire rope until it sings like a blade under strain. Somewhere up the mountain, the trunk breaks free. The first log jerks forward. Another follows. Then the entire slope erupts. Dozens of massive trees begin sliding through the snow, carving deep scars into the hillside as they accelerate downhill. The sound is overwhelming, wood grinding against stone, branches snapping like rifle fire, the scream of metal cable straining against impossible weight. The machine does not slow. Steam pressure drives the drums faster, dragging the forest toward the clearing with relentless force. Logs collide with one another as they descend, twisting and bouncing across the slope like battering rams. A single trunk can weigh 5 tons. Here there are 50. When they reach the bottom, the logs slam into the landing with a violence that shakes the ground beneath the camp. Snow explodes into the air. Chains rattle loose. The cable finally slackens as the engineer closes the throttle. For a moment, the mountain falls silent again. Steam hisses from the valves as the iron engine settles back into stillness. The clearing is now filled with timber, an entire section of forest delivered in a single pull. Within minutes, the crews move forward again. The choker setters begin unfastening chains. Another signal will soon climb the mountain, and the machine will drag the forest down once more. The machine in the clearing was built for one purpose: to move forests. Not one tree at a time, not even a dozen. Entire slopes of timber, hundreds of tons of wood, were meant to slide down mountains under the pull of its cables. Before machines like this appeared in the forests of North America, logging was slow and brutal in a different way. Trees were cut by hand and dragged out of the woods using teams of horses or oxen. In winter, men relied on snow and ice to reduce friction so that sleds loaded with logs could be pulled along narrow trails. But animals had limits. A team of horses might haul one large trunk, perhaps two. A mountain full of timber could take years to clear. Industry did not have that kind of patience. By the late 19th century, the appetite for wood had reached a scale no human workforce could satisfy alone. Cities were rising across the continent. Entire railroads were being driven through wilderness that had never seen steel before. Every mile of track required thousands of wooden ties. Mines demanded timber for underground supports. Shipyards needed vast quantities of lumber for hulls, masts, and docks. Even the cities themselves were built from wood. Houses, bridges, warehouses, streets, factories. The expanding industrial world consumed forests as if they were fuel, and the forests that remained were no longer easy to reach. Early logging operations had stripped the accessible valleys and riverbanks. What remained stood deep in the mountains, where steep slopes and thick terrain made traditional hauling almost impossible. The trees were there, but getting them out of the forest was another matter entirely. The steam logging engine solved that problem with ruthless efficiency. Where horses strained to drag a single log, the iron machine could pull dozens at once. Its cables stretched across hillsides that animals could never climb. Its drums wound steel rope with mechanical strength that did not tire in cold weather or deep snow. What once took weeks of labor could be done in a single pull. The forest no longer resisted. Mountainsides that once stood untouched for centuries could now be stripped in months. But the machine's power created a contradiction that would define the entire industry. The same engine that allowed civilization to expand also demanded an enormous price from the men who operated it. Every time the drums turned, the cables carried forces measured not in pounds but in tons. A single line could snap with the explosive violence of artillery. Logs dragged across slopes could ricochet like falling walls. A misjudged signal or a broken pulley could turn the hillside into a lethal avalanche of timber. The machine did not distinguish between wood and flesh. It only pulled. To the companies that owned the forests, the steam engine was a miracle of industrial progress. To the men who worked beside it, the machine was something else entirely, a creature of iron that fed endlessly on the mountain, and sometimes on the men themselves. By the final decades of the 19th century, the forests of North America had become the foundation of an expanding industrial civilization. Wood was everywhere. Before steel-framed skyscrapers rose over cities, buildings were raised from timber. Streets were paved with wooden blocks. Bridges stretched across rivers on massive wooden beams. Entire towns were constructed from boards cut in distant forests and carried across the continent by rail. Even the railroads themselves depended on wood. Every mile of track required thousands of railroad ties, thick rectangular timbers laid beneath the steel rails. A single railroad line stretching from the eastern cities toward the western frontier consumed entire forests simply to support the weight of locomotives. The scale was staggering. By the 1880s, the United States was producing billions of board feet of lumber every year. Sawmills roared along riverbanks from Michigan to Washington state. Logging companies pushed deeper into mountain valleys, searching for stands of untouched timber. The forests closest to transportation routes had already fallen. In the early years of the lumber industry, loggers relied on rivers to move their harvest. Trees were cut during winter and stacked along frozen banks. When spring thaw arrived, the logs were rolled into swollen rivers and floated downstream to sawmills waiting near coastal ports. But rivers could only carry timber that stood nearby. Once the forests along the waterways were gone, the industry faced a growing problem. The remaining stands of Douglas fir, cedar, and hemlock were located far inland, often perched on steep mountainsides where no river flowed close enough to transport them. These trees were enormous. Many stood more than 200 feet tall. Some trunks measured 6 feet across at the base. A single mature fir might weigh 10 tons after it was cut. Hauling such timber through steep wilderness with horses alone was painfully slow. Roads were nearly impossible to build across rugged terrain. Wagons could not climb the slopes where the best timber grew. Even sleds dragged across winter snow required dozens of animals and weeks of labor. Yet the demand for lumber continued to climb. Railroads were spreading across the continent at a relentless pace. Cities like Chicago, Seattle, and San Francisco expanded outward, with wooden neighborhoods rising almost overnight. Mining operations in the Rocky Mountains demanded massive quantities of support beams to prevent underground tunnels from collapsing. The industry needed more wood, and it needed it faster. By the 1890s, the pressure had become impossible to ignore. Lumber companies were staring at mountains filled with valuable timber they could see but could not reach. The forests were there. The markets were waiting. But between them stood steep terrain, brutal winters, and distances too great for traditional hauling methods. What the logging industry required was a machine powerful enough to ignore the geography entirely. A machine that could drag trees straight down the mountains themselves. In the coming years, engineers and inventors would provide exactly that, and once the machine arrived, the mountains would never be quiet again. The solution began not in the mountains but beside the railroads. By the middle of the 19th century, steam power had already transformed transportation and manufacturing. Locomotives hauled freight across continents. Stationary engines drove factory machinery in crowded industrial cities. The technology was proven, powerful, and adaptable. What no one had yet done was place that power inside the forest. Early logging camps experimented with small steam engines originally designed for rail yards. These machines were used to wind cable and pull individual logs across flat ground. The concept was simple. If steam could move trains, it could move timber. But the first attempts were crude. The engines were heavy and awkward to transport. Their boilers were never designed for the harsh conditions of remote forests. More importantly, the hauling systems attached to them lacked the mechanical strength needed to drag massive trees down steep terrain. Yet the idea refused to disappear. Among the men working along the Pacific coast in the 1880s was an inventor named John Dolbear. Dolbear had spent years observing the difficulties faced by logging crews. He understood the core problem. The forest was full of valuable timber, but the effort required to move each tree from the hillside to the landing was painfully slow. Dolbear imagined something different. Instead of dragging logs individually with horses, why not stretch a steel cable through the forest and use a steam engine to pull everything at once? The principle resembled a giant mechanical fishing line cast across the mountain. The engine would sit at the base of the slope, anchored securely to the ground. A steel cable would run from the machine up through a series of pulleys attached to standing trees. Fallen logs would be chained to the cable. Then the engine would simply pull. The entire load would slide down the mountain. In 1881, Dolbear patented the machine that would soon become known as the steam donkey engine. The name came from its role in the camp. In earlier days, smaller auxiliary engines used in shipyards had been called donkey engines because they performed heavy lifting tasks, much like draft animals. Loggers adopted the same term for the new hauling machines. But the scale was entirely different. These engines were not small assistants. They were enormous stationary machines weighing anywhere from 15 to 30 tons. Each carried a massive boiler capable of producing intense steam pressure. At the front of the machine, thick steel drums wound hundreds of feet of wire cable capable of hauling loads that would have been impossible for animals. When the first donkey engines were installed in logging camps along the California coast, their impact was immediate. Forests that once required months of labor to harvest could now be stripped with mechanical speed. Entire slopes of timber could be dragged to the landing in a single pull. Logging camps began ordering the machines as quickly as manufacturers could produce them. By the early 20th century, steam donkey engines had spread across the forests of Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. Dozens of different models were produced, each larger and more powerful than the last. The machines transformed the industry, but they also transformed the mountains themselves, and the men who worked beside them soon discovered that controlling such power came with dangers few had anticipated. The machine itself was deceptively simple. At a distance, the steam donkey appeared little more than a squat iron engine sitting on a wooden sled, but inside its riveted shell enormous forces were being created and controlled with brutal precision. Everything began with the boiler. The heart of the engine was a thick steel cylinder mounted horizontally along the frame. Inside it, hundreds of gallons of water surrounded a network of fire tubes carrying heat from the firebox. Coal or wood burned constantly beneath the boiler, heating the metal until the water inside turned to steam. Pressure climbed quickly, 100 pounds per square inch, sometimes more. That steam was then directed into a pair of heavy cylinders mounted along the side of the machine. Inside each cylinder, a piston moved back and forth under the force of expanding steam. Every stroke drove a crankshaft connected to the hauling drums at the front of the engine. With each turn of the shaft, the drums rotated. And as the drums rotated, the cable wound tighter. The wire rope itself was a technological marvel for its time. Made from twisted strands of steel, the cable could measure over an inch in diameter. Hundreds of feet, sometimes more than 1,000, were wrapped around the drum in layered coils. Each foot of cable carried enormous tension. When the engine engaged, the rope transmitted that force across the mountain. To guide the cable across difficult terrain, loggers used a network of pulleys known as blocks. These heavy steel wheels were attached high in the trunks of standing trees called spar trees. By routing the cable through multiple blocks, the logging crew could change the direction of the pull and increase the mechanical advantage of the system. A single drum could haul dozens of logs simultaneously. More advanced donkey engines carried multiple drums. One drum hauled the logs downhill while another controlled a secondary cable that returned empty chokers back up the mountain. This allowed the machine to operate continuously, pulling timber down the slope while preparing the next load above. But all of this power depended on one thing: control. The engineer operated the machine from a narrow platform beside the boiler. From here, he controlled the throttle, the braking levers, and the clutch mechanisms that engaged each drum. Every movement of the cables depended on his judgment. Too little power and the logs would refuse to move. Too much, and the cable could snap under the strain. Even the anchors holding the machine in place had to be carefully constructed. Because the donkey engine pulled enormous loads uphill toward itself, the entire machine was constantly being dragged forward by the force it generated. To prevent this, loggers buried massive wooden timbers into the ground behind the engine. These anchors were chained to the frame, holding the 30-ton machine in place while it pulled against the mountain. When the throttle opened fully, the machine could generate enough force to move hundreds of tons of timber at once. The hillside became a conveyor belt of wood. Trees that had stood for centuries were dragged across the forest floor in minutes. But the same engineering that gave the machine its strength also created a hidden danger. Every cable carried tension powerful enough to destroy anything caught in its path. And when something failed, it failed violently. The steam donkey did not fail quietly. When something broke, the consequences were immediate and violent. The most dangerous element in the entire system was the cable itself. A steel wire rope stretched across a mountainside carried immense tension. When the drums began pulling a load of timber downhill, the cable tightened until it vibrated like a drawn bowstring. Every inch of that rope stored energy, sometimes hundreds of tons of force. If the cable remained intact, the system worked exactly as intended. Logs slid down the mountain, and the machine completed its pull without incident. But steel is not immune to fatigue. Each haul dragged the cable across rock, stumps, and frozen soil. The wire strands scraped against rough surfaces as the logs bounced and twisted across the hillside. Over time, the rope began to weaken. Individual strands snapped. Tiny breaks appeared along the twisted metal. Most of the time, the damage went unnoticed until it was too late. When a weakened cable finally failed, it did not simply fall to the ground, it exploded. The moment tension disappeared from one section of the rope, the remaining cable snapped backward toward the engine with terrifying speed. Loggers described the sound as a rifle crack followed by a violent whip through the air. A cable under heavy load could recoil hundreds of feet. Anything standing in its path was struck with devastating force. Men were cut in half. Limbs were torn away. Trees themselves could be shattered by the flying steel. And the cable was only one of the dangers. Sometimes the logs themselves became the weapon. A load of timber sliding down a mountain rarely moved in perfect alignment. Trunks collided with each other as they descended, bouncing across rocks and broken stumps. One log might suddenly jam against another, halting the entire load while the cable continued pulling from below. Tension would build instantly. The machine continued to wind the drum, the cable tightening further as the logs resisted. Then the jam would break. When it did, the trapped log could shoot downhill like a launched battering ram. The enormous trunk might weigh several tons and travel at frightening speed, crashing through brush and trees as it accelerated. Men working along the slope had only seconds to react. Sometimes they were too close. Other failures were even more catastrophic. Boilers occasionally ruptured under extreme pressure. If the water level inside the boiler dropped too low, exposed metal plates could overheat and weaken. When cold water suddenly contacted that superheated surface, the result could be a steam explosion powerful enough to tear the machine apart. Such disasters were rare, but when they occurred, they obliterated everything nearby. The donkey engine itself could become shrapnel. Even under normal operation, the machine demanded constant vigilance. The engineer had to watch pressure gauges, control the throttle, and interpret signal lines from workers scattered across the mountain. A single mistake could turn routine hauling into chaos. Because once the drums began turning, the system could not easily be stopped. The machine only knew one action: to pull, and whatever stood between the cable and the landing would be dragged down the mountain with it. Winter logging camps existed at the edge of endurance. Most camps were built far from towns, deep in the mountains where the timber still stood thick and untouched. Reaching them often required hours of travel along narrow logging roads carved through the forest. Once the snow arrived, those roads became nearly impassable. For the men who worked there, the camp became an isolated world of wood smoke, machinery, and cold. A typical camp housed between 30 and 100 workers. They slept in long bunkhouses built from rough timber, heated by iron stoves that burned day and night. Inside, rows of narrow bunks were stacked close together, each filled with wool blankets damp from melting snow and sweat. Privacy did not exist. At dawn, the cookhouse bell rang, echoing through the dark forest long before sunrise. Men rose stiffly from their bunks and dressed in layers of wool and canvas. Heavy boots were pulled over thick socks. Suspenders held up trousers patched repeatedly from weeks of hard labor. Breakfast was large and heavy. Piles of bacon, fried potatoes, biscuits, and coffee, strong enough to cut through the morning cold. A logger might consume thousands of calories before the day even began. The work demanded it. Within minutes, the camp emptied. Crews moved into the forest carrying axes, crosscut saws, wedges, and chains. In winter, the snow helped logs slide downhill more easily, but it also made the terrain treacherous. Hidden beneath the snow were broken branches, slick ice, and uneven ground that could twist a knee or ankle instantly. The first crew reached the trees. Fallers worked in pairs, their long cross-cut saw biting slowly into the base of massive trunks. Each pull of the saw sent curls of wood spiraling into the snow. The rhythm was steady, methodical. A large Douglas fir could take hours to bring down. When the final fibers snapped, the tree collapsed with thunderous force. The crash echoed across the valley. Soon the hillside was littered with fallen giants. That was when the second crew moved in. Choker setters were among the most dangerous positions in the camp. Their job was to attach steel cables around each log before the donkey engine began hauling. Working quickly across the slope, they wrapped heavy chains around the trunks and fastened the cable chokers that would drag the logs downhill. The moment they signaled the engineer, the mountain came alive. Logs began sliding through the snow toward the landing below. Choker setters had to scramble uphill as the timber moved, climbing across slippery ground while massive trunks accelerated past them. There was no safe distance. A shifting log could suddenly roll sideways. A cable might jerk violently as tension increased. Men learned to read the sounds of the system, the whine of steel rope, the cracking of branches, the rising thunder of sliding timber. One mistake meant death. At the bottom of the hill, the landing crew waited beside the donkey engine. Their job was to unfasten the cables, separate the logs, and stack the timber into enormous piles ready for transport. Here the air smelled of steam and sap. The engine roared constantly, its boiler venting clouds of white vapor into the freezing air. Grease covered the machinery. The ground was churned into a mixture of mud, bark, and snow stained dark by oil. Work continued for 10 or 12 hours each day. By evening, the men returned to the bunkhouse exhausted. Muscles ached, hands were blistered and swollen. Yet the routine repeated itself every morning as long as the timber remained. Because the machine did not rest, and as long as the engine kept pulling, the forest kept falling. Morning arrived under a gray sky heavy with new snow. The hillside above the camp had been cut the previous afternoon. Dozens of towering firs now lay scattered across the slope, their branches buried beneath fresh powder that softened the landscape but concealed its dangers. From the landing below, the donkey engine waited with steam building in its boiler. Choker setters climbed the mountain before dawn, moving carefully among the fallen trunks. Their breath fogged in the frozen air as they fastened cable chokers around the logs one by one. Steel chains clinked against bark while the men worked quickly to prepare the haul. Nearly 40 logs lay attached to the line. Together they weighed more than 200 tons. Below them the engineer watched the signal cord. 2 sharp pulls. Ready. The throttle opened. Steam surged into the cylinders and the hauling drums began to turn. Steel cable tightened across the mountain until the lines sang under strain. At first the logs shifted slowly. Snow cracked beneath the enormous weight as the trunks broke free from the frozen ground. One by one they began sliding downhill, carving shallow tracks through the snow. Then the slope steepened, gravity joined the pull of the machine. The logs accelerated. From the hillside came the rising roar of timber moving through the forest. Trunks collided and bounced against one another as they descended. Branches snapped. Snow erupted in clouds as the load gathered speed. At the landing, the crew stepped back, waiting for the massive timber to arrive. But halfway down the mountain, something changed. One of the largest logs struck a buried stump and twisted sideways. The trunk jammed between two standing trees, halting the entire load behind it. Instantly, the cable tightened. The donkey engine continued pulling. At the landing, the engineer saw the tension building in the line. The cable stretched rigid across the hillside, vibrating under enormous pressure. He pulled the throttle closed. But the drums had already wound too much cable. The strain held. High above the camp, the jammed log suddenly broke free. The entire load lunged forward. 40 massive trunks surged downhill at once. The cable jerked violently as the weight of the moving timber increased. The line whipped across the slope as the logs bounced through the forest, gaining speed with every second. One of the choker setters was still climbing uphill. He had been moving toward safety when the jam occurred. When the load broke loose, the avalanche of timber was suddenly behind him. A 5-ton trunk slammed into a boulder and ricocheted sideways across the slope. There was no time to escape. The log struck the man with crushing force and carried him several yards before the cable dragged the trunk onward. The rest of the load continued racing downhill. When the logs finally crashed into the landing, the impact shook the clearing like an earthquake. Snow burst into the air. Chains rattled loose as the timber piled against one another in a tangled mass. For several seconds no one spoke. The engine hissed quietly as steam escaped from its valves. Then the crew began climbing the mountain. They already knew what they would find. Accidents like this were not unusual in the logging camps of the early 20th century. The combination of steep terrain, enormous loads, and mechanical power created conditions where a single miscalculation could turn routine work into disaster. By the end of the day, the machine would be pulling again, because the forest still stood above the camp, and the industry that depended on it did not pause for grief. Once the steam donkey engines spread across the forests of the Pacific Northwest, the landscape began to change with a speed that earlier generations could scarcely imagine. Before the arrival of mechanized hauling, logging had advanced slowly. Crews cut timber along riverbanks or near rough wagon roads where animals could drag the logs to nearby mills. Vast areas of mountain forest remained untouched simply because reaching them required too much labor. The donkey engine erased that limitation. Steel cables stretched across slopes that horses could never climb. Logs that once lay beyond the reach of traditional logging methods were suddenly pulled downhill with mechanical force. Entire mountainsides could now be harvested from a single landing where the machine was anchored. The process expanded rapidly. Logging companies established camps deeper and deeper inside the forests. Portable railroads were built to carry the timber away once it reached the landing. Steam locomotives hauled long trains of freshly cut logs toward coastal mills, where saw blades turned the giant trunks into boards, beams, and railroad ties. The effect on the forests was immediate. Where dense stands of Douglas fir and cedar had once covered the mountains, clearings began to appear. Hillsides stripped of timber were left scattered with stumps and broken branches. Without the canopy of trees, heavy rains washed soil down the slopes, carving new channels through the land. The transformation could be seen for miles. Photographs from the early 20th century show entire valleys where the forest had been reduced to fields of stumps stretching across the horizon. Yet to the lumber companies and the cities that depended on their timber, this destruction was viewed differently. Wood from those mountains built houses for growing populations. It framed factories, warehouses, and rail depots. It supported mines that pulled copper, coal, and silver from deep underground. The lumber industry fueled construction across a continent, expanding faster than any nation before it. The steam donkey engine stood at the center of that transformation. It was the machine that allowed the mountains to be harvested at industrial speed, but the cost of that progress was written across the landscape itself. Forests that had taken centuries to grow were gone within a generation, and long after the engines fell silent, the scars they left behind remained visible on the mountains. By the 1920s, the age of the steam donkey was already beginning to fade. The machines that had once dominated the logging camps were powerful, but they were also heavy, complex, and expensive to maintain. Boilers required constant fuel and water. Engineers needed experience to control the engines safely. Entire crews were required simply to operate the system of cables, pulleys, and signal lines that stretched across the forest. New technology was beginning to replace them. Internal combustion engines, smaller, lighter, and easier to transport, started appearing in the woods. Gasoline and diesel-powered tractors could move across the terrain instead of remaining anchored to a single landing. Later machines carried hydraulic arms and grapples capable of lifting individual logs without the massive cable systems that defined earlier logging methods. Gradually, the steam engines disappeared. Some were dismantled and sold as scrap metal when their boilers wore out. Others were abandoned in remote camps where rust slowly consumed the iron frames. In a few places, the engines were simply left where they last operated, their cables removed and their fireboxes cold forever. The forests continued to be logged. But the era of the 30-ton iron-hauling engine, the machine that dragged entire hillsides of timber with steam and steel, had ended. Today, the mountains are quiet again. In many of the valleys where the logging camps once stood, new forests have grown. Young fir trees rise from soil that was once churned by sled runners and machinery. Moss covers the rotting stumps left behind by the first industrial harvests. Occasionally hidden deep among the trees, the rusted remains of the steam donkey still lie where they were abandoned. A steel drum half buried in the earth. A boiler collapsed under decades of rain and snow. Fragments of the machine that once pulled forests down mountains. The cables are gone, the engines are silent. But for decades, these iron monsters reshaped entire landscapes, dragging timber from mountainsides and feeding the growing cities of an industrial world. And in the quiet forests that have grown since, the scars of that era remain written into the land.